Good morning. Today is Wednesday, April 22nd, and we are about to read George Orwell's 1984. We're going to skip ahead. So this book is comprised of 3 parts, and at the end of each part, we are going to do, hold on, if you guys remember the story arc that everybody knows and loves, where there's the introduction, rising action, climax, descending, resolution. That's what we're going to be doing in this for all parts, and then hopefully we'll be able to combine them all. But let's begin with part 1, chapter 1. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide. The face of a man of about 45, with a heavy black mustache, and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present, the electric was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite of the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about where you move. Big Brother is watching you. The caption ran beneath. The caption beneath it ran. So just for context sake, let's find a color for context. We'll do red. For context, where was it? This guy right here. This is just another word for elevator. It's what the British call it, because they call everything some sort of silly name or a very on-the-nose name. I'm going to take a quick water break, and then we will resume. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror which formed on the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen, it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of winter had just ended. So, we're going to highlight something real quick. We're going to highlight this right here. Oops, I wanted it to be yellow. And I'm going to ask, what color do I want for my questions? Let's make it purple. Really? Okay. Why can't we turn off TV? Outside, even through the shut window pane, The world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals. And though the sun was shining in the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything, except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The big black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the front house immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the caption said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at street level, another poster, torn at one corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, alternating covering and uncovering the single word INGSOC. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and darted away with a curving flight. It was the police patrol, snooping into people's windows. The patrol didn't matter, however, only the thought police mattered. So, we get a little bit of context, yeah? So, we're going to... So you have police patrol, and you have thought police. But this one is higher. And I'm also going to highlight this guy. Because if you guys read Animal Farm, there is a lot of repetition, and anything that's capitalized and repeated is often a big indicator of what the story is going to, that the story is going to go more into depth. George Orwell, though he did not write a lot, these are kind of his signature indicators. So I'm going to write that this is repetition / foreshadowing. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still blabbling away about pig iron and the overfulfillment of the ninth 3-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. However, how often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time, but at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to be did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you make was overheard and, except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Winston kept his back turned to the TV. It was safer, though, as he well knew, even a backhand can be revealing. A kilometer away, the Ministry of Truth, his place of work, towered vast and white above the grimy landscape. This, he thought, was with a sort of vague distaste, this was London, chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood story that should tell him whether London has always been quite like this. There were always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with bulks of timber, their windows patched with cardboard, and their roofs cut with corrugated iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions, and the bombed sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air, and the willow herb strangled over the heaps of rubble. In the places where the bombs had cleared a large patch, and there had sprung up storied colonies of wooden dwellings like chicken houses. But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright-lipped tableaus occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. The Ministry of Truth, Minitrue, in Newspeak. Newspeak was the official language of Oceania. For an account of its structure and etymology, see appendix. Was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up terrace after terrace 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out on its white face in elegant letters, the three slogans of the party. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. I'm going to make a comment about this. That all of this, that these two very contradictory. Contradicting. And this implies to be compliant. Is strength. The Ministry of Truth contained, it was said, 3,000 rooms above ground level, and corresponding ramifications below. Scattered about London, there were about 3 other buildings of similar appearance and size. So completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture that was from the roof of the Victory Mansions, you could see all 4 of them simultaneously. They were houses of the 4 ministries between which the entire apparatus of government was divided. The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for the economic affairs. Their names in Newspeak, Minitrue, Mini Pax, Mini Love, and Mini Plenty. So I also want to comment on this. I feel like I'm going to do a lot more annotations with this, with 1984 compared to Slaughterhouse 5. All of this, I don't know if you guys read Feed last semester, but it was, a lot of the language was not as sophisticated compared to, let's say, for a dystopian novel, The Hunger Games. And I'm seeing that they're also trying to dumb down the population in this novel as well. So I'm just going to write... that they're dumbing down language and the populace as an outcome. The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. It was a place impossible to enter except on official business, and then only by penetrating through the maze of barbed wired entanglements, steel doors, and hidden gun machine nests. Even the streets leading up to its outer barriers were roamed by guerrilla-faced guards in black uniforms, armed with joined truncheons. Winston turned around abruptly. He set his features into the expression of a quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the screen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at this time of day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of colorless liquor with a plain white label marked Victory Gin. It gave off a sickly, oily smell, as of Chinese rice spirit. Winston poured out nearly a teacupful, nerved himself for a shock, and gulped it down like a dose of medicine. Instantly, his face turned scarlet and water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it, one had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning in his belly died down, and the world began to look more cheerful. He took a cigarette from a crumpled packet marked Victory Cigarettes and incautiously held it upright, whereupon the tobacco fell on the floor. With the next, he was more successful. He went back to the living room and sat down at a table that stood to the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer, he took out a pen holder, a bottle of ink, and a thick quarto-sized blank book with a red back and a marbled color. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed, as was normal, in the end of the wall there, where it would command the whole room, it was the longer wall, opposite to the window. To one side of it there was a shallow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to maintain outside the range of the telescreen, so far as sight went. He could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in his present position, he could not be seen. It was particularly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him the thing that he was about to do now. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a peculiarly beautiful book. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was a kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. He could guess, however, that the book was much older than that. He had seen it lying in the window of a frowsy little junk shop in a slummy quarter of town. Just what quarter he did not now remember. And it had stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed to not go into ordinary shops. Dealing on the free market, it was called. But the rule was not strictly kept, because there were various things, such as shoelaces and razor blades, which is impossible to get a hold of in any other way. He had given a quick glance up and down the street, and then slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the time, he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular purpose. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase. Even with nothing written in it, it was a compromising possession. So I'm going to make an inference here. I am making this inference because, especially this last one right here, that he's not allowed to keep a diary, which means that even if he just wanted to talk about his day and his feelings, that is technically an original thought in the society, which would not be allowed since they're being surveillance all the time. What happens if he has a bad day and he talks about something negative? I would presume that the society or the thought police would come and take him. and I think I'm about to get an answer to my inference. The thing that he was about to do was to open a diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal, since there were no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death, or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into the pencil holder and sucked into it to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used, only even for signatures, and he had procured one furtively and with some difficulty, because of the feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it is usual to dictate everything into a speak write, which of course impossible for his present purpose. I know you guys are gonna get so upset that I keep pausing. Let's make a different color. Let's go pink. I want to highlight this right here. Because this right here reminds me, this is my connection. It reminds me of how in K-12, from what I've seen at WPS, a lot of the younger kids, so let's go primary, K-2, don't write a lot anymore. And they also use speak to text. And also, it might seem minimal, but speak write instead of speak to text, it's minimal. It's just a shortcut of saying it, but also it could be inferred again that we are trying to dumb down the population. He dipped the pen into the ink and then faltered for just a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was a decisive act. In a small, clumsy letters, he wrote, April 4th, 1984. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984. It must be around about that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 1945. But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? For the future? For the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment round the doubtful date on the page, and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word, doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its natural impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. For some time he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he originally intended to say. For weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment, and it had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was to transfer to the paper the interminable, restless monologue that had been running inside his head, literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itching unbearably. He dared not scratch it, because if he did so, it would always become inflamed. The seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him, the itching of the skin above his ankle, the blaring of the music, and a slight booziness caused by the gin. Suddenly, he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting strangled up and down the page, shredding first its capital letters and finally even in its full stops. April 4th, 1984. Late night to the flicks. All war films. One very good one of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. Audience much amused by shots of a great huge fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First you saw him wallowing along in the water like a porpoise. Then you saw him through the helicopter's gun sights. Then he was full of holes and the sea around him turned pink and he sank as suddenly as though the holes had let in the water. Audience shout with laughter when he sank. Then you saw a lifeboat full of children with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman who had been a Jewess sitting up in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. Little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head between her breasts as if he was trying to burrow right into her, and the woman putting her arms around him and comforting him, although she was blue and with fright herself. All the time covering him up as much as possible, as if her arms could keep the bullets off of him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb, and among them terrific flash, and the boat went all to the matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of the child's arm going up, 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 right up into the air. A helicopter with a camera in its nose must have followed it up. And there was a lot of applause from the party seats, but a woman down in the pearl part of the house suddenly starts kicking up a fuss and shouting they didn't oughter of showed it not in front of kids and ain't right not in front of the kids until the police turned her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her body. Nobody cares what the proles say. Typically prole reaction, they never. All right. So, if you're in my class, you know, grammar is a huge thing. This is evidence to my CER. So, I don't remember what color I had, whatever. So, my claim, dumbing population. This whole paragraph, all of this is proof that we are dumbing down the population. That, as you can see, there's not a lot. He loses track of capitalizing things. He's repeating himself and not revising his work. He's saying ain't a lot, which unfortunately ain't is not proper English. So my theory is panning out. Now, I need to add a reasoning to this. My reasoning, which is an inference from what we've gathered from the 11 pages I think that I've read? Yeah, from the 11 pages I've read, I believe it is because I believe that Oceania believes that if they dumb down their population and maintain good yes ma'am, yes sir workers, then they will never have an uprising. Hopefully, my theory will pan out. Winston stopped writing, partly because his hand was because he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what made him pour out this stream of rubbish. But the curious thing was that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind, to the point where he almost felt equal to writing it down. It was, he now realized, because of this other incident that he had suddenly that he had suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. It happened that morning at the ministry. If anything, so nebulous that could be said to happen. It was nearly 1100 in the records department, where Winston worked. They were dragging the chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in the center of the hall opposite of the telescreen, in preparation for the 2 minutes hate. Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows when two people whom he knew by sight but had never spoken to came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl whom he often passed in the corridors. He didn't know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department, presumably since he had sometimes seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner. She had some mechanical job on one of the novel writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl of about 27, with thick hair, a freckled face, and swift athletic movements. A narrow scarlet sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League, wound several times around the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shapeliness of her hips. Winston disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because of the atmosphere of hockey fields and cold baths and community hikes and general clean-mindedness which she managed to carry about with her. He disliked nearly all women, especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the women, above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies and noser-outs of unorthodoxy. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than most. Once they passed in the corridor, she gave him a quick sidelong glance which seemed to pierce right into him, and for a moment had filled him with black terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police. So we're going to make a comment. Surprise, surprise. He is definitely an incel, and I believe that is a creation of the party. Because the fact they have the Junior Anti-Sex League and the idea that he dislikes her slowly because of her gender and because there is an idea that women are always anti-party and always try to go out of their way to speak ill and try to catch people in the act. That it was true was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel a peculiar uneasiness for which had fear mixed up in it as well as hostility whenever she was anywhere near him. The other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the inner party and holder of some post so important and remote that Winston had only a dim idea of its nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people round the chairs as they saw black overalls of an inner party member approaching. O'Brien was a large, burly man with a thick neck and a coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of his formidable appearance, he had a certain charm of manner. He had a trick of resettling his spectacles on his nose, which was a curiously disarming, in some indefinable way, curiously civilized. It was a gesture which, if anyone had still thought of such terms, might have recalled an 18th century nobleman offering his snuff-box. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, and not solely because he was intrigued by the contrast between O'Brien's urbane manner and his prize fighter's physique. Much more it was because of a secretly held belief, or not even a belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested it irresistibly. And again, perhaps it was not even unorthodoxy that was written in his face, but simply intelligence. But at any rate, he had the appearance of being a person you could talk to if somehow you could cheat this telescreen and get him alone. Winston had never made the smallest effort to verify that guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so. At this moment, O'Brien glanced at his wristwatch, saw it was nearly 1100, and evidently decided to stay in the records department until the 2-minute hate was over. He took a chair in the same row as Winston, a couple of places away. A small, sandy-haired woman who was working in the cubicle next to Winston was between them. The girl with dark hair was sitting immediately behind. The next moment was hideous, grinding speech, as of some monstrous machine running without oil, bursting from the telescreen at the end of the room. It was a noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled the hair at the back of one's necks. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed on the screen. There were hisses here and there among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was the renegade and the backslider who once, long ago, how long ago, nobody quite remembered, had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on a level with Big Brother himself, and then had engaged in counter-revolutionary activities and condemned to death, and had mysteriously escaped and disappeared. The programmings of the 2-minute hate varied from day to day, but there was none of which in which Goldstein was not the principal figure. He was the primal traitor, the earliest defier of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations spring directly out of his teaching. Somewhere or other, he was still alive and hatching his conspiracies. Perhaps somewhere beyond the sea, under the protection of his foreign paymasters. Perhaps, even, it was so occasionally rumored, in some hiding place in Oceania itself. So, what exactly did he do? A question that I have that hopefully will be answered by the end of the book, but I am not confident. Winston's diaphragm was constricted. He could never see the face of Goldstein without a painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean Jewish face, with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and a small goatee beard. A clever face, yet somehow inherently despicable, with a kind of senile silliness in the long thin nose, near the end of which a pair of spectacles was perched. It resembled the face of a sheep, and a voice, too, had a sheep-like quality. Goldstein was delivering his usual venomous attack against the doctrines of the party, an attack so exaggerated and perverse that a child should have been able to see through it, and yet just plausible enough to fill one with an alarmed feeling that other people, less level-headed than oneself, might be taken by it. He was abusing Big Brother. He was denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace with Eurasia. He was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. He was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed. And all of this in rapid polysyllabic speech, which was a sort of parody of the habitual style of orators of the party, and even contained newspeak words, more newspeak words, indeed, than any party member would normally use in real life. So, one connection that I think is a pretty easy connection to make. Let's see. Oops, did not mean to cross out. I want to highlight. Since this is about 1984, which we all know that after that is during kind of the Cold War era and post-World War II, I'm wondering if the author is trying to make an alternative reality of what happened with the Nazis. and if adding that he's Jewish is to heavily imply that theory. But maybe we'll find out more as we read. And all the while, lest one should be in any doubt as to the reality which Goldstein's specious claptrap covered, behind his head on the telescreen there marched the endless columns of the Eurasian army, row after row of solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces, who swarm up to the surface of the screen and vanish, to be replaced by others exactly familiar. The dull tramp of the soldier's boots formed the background of Goldstein's bleeding voice. Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrolled exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. The self-satisfied, sheep-like face on the screen and the terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it were too much to be borne. Besides, the sight or even the thought of Goldstein produced fear and anger automatically. He was an object of hatred more constant than either Eurasia or East Asia. Since Oceania was at war with one of these powers, it was generally at peace with the other. But what was strange was that although Goldstein was hated and despised by everybody, although every day and 1,000 times a day, on platforms, on the telescreen, in newspapers and books, his theories were refuted, smashed, ridiculed, held up to the general gaze for the pitiful rubbish that they were. In spite of all of this, his influence never seemed to grow less. Always there was fresh dupes waiting to be seduced by him. A day never passed when spies and saboteurs acting under his directions were not amassed by the thought police. He was the commander of a vast, shadowy army, underground network of conspirators dedicated to overthrow the state. The Brotherhood, its name was supposed to be. There were also whispered stories of a terrible book, a compendium of all the heresies, of which Goldstein was the author, and in which circulated clandestinely here and there. It was a book without a title. People referred to it, if at all, simply as the book. But no one knew of such things, only through vague rumors. Neither the Brotherhood nor the book was a subject that any ordinary party member would mention if there was a way of avoiding it. In its second minute, the hate rose to a frenzy. People were leaping up and down in their places, shouting at the tops of their voices in an effort to drown the maddening, bleating voice that came from the screen. The little sandy-haired woman had turned bright pink, and her mouth was opening and shutting like that of a landed fish. Even O'Brien's heavy face was flushed. He was sitting very straight in his chair, his powerful chest swelling and quivering as though he were standing up to be the assault of a wave. The dark-haired girl behind Winston began crying out, "Swine, swine, swine!" Suddenly she picked up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. In a lucid moment, Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. The horrible thing about the 2-minute hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but, on the contrary, that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, a torture to smash faces in with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one even against one's will into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion that would be switched from one object to another like a flame of a blowtorch. Thus, at one moment, Winston's hatred was not turned against Goldstein at all, but, on the contrary, against Big Brother, the party, and the thought police. In such moments, his heart went out to a lonely, derided heretic on the screen, sole guardian of truth and sanity in the world of lies, and yet that very instant he was at one with the people around him, and all was said about Goldstein seemed to him to be true. At those moments, his secret loathing of Big Brother changed to adoration, and Big Brother seemed to tower up, an invincible, fearless protector, standing like a rock against the hordes of Asia. And Goldstein, in spite of his isolation, his helplessness, and the doubt that hung about his very existence, seemed like some sinister enchanter, capable by mere power of his voice of wrecking the structure of civilization. So a connection that I also have on here was when North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un's father, because I remember seeing on the news everyone in mass hysteria during the funeral. It was never demanded, so to speak, but it was definitely a cult and mob-like mentality. Where was I? It was even possible in moments to switch one's hatred this way or that by a voluntary act. Suddenly, by the sort of violent effort which one wrenches one's head away from the pillow in a nightmare. Winston succeeded in transferring his hatred from the face on the screen to the dark-haired girl behind him. Vivid, beautiful hallucinations flashed through his mind. He would flog her to death with a rubber truncheon. He would tie her naked to a stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian. He would ravish her and cut her throat open at the moment of climax. Better than before, moreover, he realized why it was that he hated her. He hated her because she was young and pretty and sexless, because he wanted to go to bed with her and would never do so, because round her sweet, supple waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, there was only the odious scarlet sash, aggressive party, a symbol of chastity. So yeah, this is just enforcing the incel theory. The hate rose to its climax. The voice of Goldstein had become an actual sheep's bleat. For an instant, the face changed into that of a sheep. Then the sheep face melted into a figure of a Eurasian soldier who seemed to be advancing, huge and terrible, his submachine gun roaring, and seeming to spring out the surface of the screen, so that the people in the front row actually flinched backwards in their seat. In the same moment, drawing a sigh of relief from everyone, the hostile figure melted into the face of Big Brother. Black-haired, black-mustachioed, full of power and mysterious calm, and so vast that it almost filled up the screen. Nobody heard what Big Brother was saying. It was merely a few words of encouragement, the sort of words that uttered in the din of battle, not distinguishable individually, but restoring confidence by the fact of being spoken. Then the face of Big Brother faded away, and instead the three slogans of the party stood out in bold capitals: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But the face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds on the screen, as though the impact that it made on everyone's eyeballs was too vivid to wear off immediately. The little sandy-haired woman flung herself forward over the back of her chair in front of her. With a tremulous murmur that sounded like "my savior," she extended her arms towards the screen. Then she buried her face in her hands. It was apparent that she was uttering a prayer. At this moment, the entire group broke into a deep, slow, rhythmical chant of "BB, BB," over and over, very slowly, with a pause in between the first B and the second. A heavy, murmurous sound, somehow curiously savage, in the background of which one seemed to hear the stamp of naked feet and throbbing of tom-toms. For perhaps as much as 30 seconds they kept it up. It was a refrain that was often heard in moments of overwhelming emotion. Partly it was sort of a hymn to the wisdom and majesty of Big Brother, but it's still more an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of conscience by means of rhythmic sound. Winston's entrails seemed to grow cold. In the 2-minute hate, he could not help sharing in the general delirium. But this subhuman chanting, B, 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 always filled him with horror. Of course, he chanted with the rest. It was impossible to do otherwise. To dissemble your feelings, to control your face, to do what everyone was doing, was an instinctive reaction. But there was a space of a couple of seconds during which the expression of his eyes might conceivably have betrayed him. And it was exactly at that moment that the significant thing happened, if indeed it did happen. Momentarily, he got O'Brien's eye. O'Brien had stood up, he had taken off his spectacles, and was in an act of resettling them on his nose with his characteristic gesture. But there was a fraction of a second where their eyes met, and for as long as it took to happen, Winston knew. Yes, he knew that O'Brien was thinking of the same thing himself. An unmistakable message had passed. It was as though their two minds had opened and the thoughts were flowing from one into the other through eyes. I am with you, O'Brien seemed to be saying to him. I know precisely what you are feeling. I know all about your contempt, your hatred, your disgust. But don't worry, I am on your side. And then a flash of intelligence was gone, and O'Brien's face was inscrutable as everybody else's. That was all, and he was already certain whether it had happened. Such incidents never had any sequel. All they had was to keep him alive in this belief, or hope that others beside himself were enemies of the party. Perhaps the rumors of vast underground conspiracies were true after all. Perhaps the Brotherhood really existed. It was impossible, in spite of the endless arrests and confessions and executions, to be sure that the Brotherhood was not simply a myth. Some days he believed in it, some days not. There was no evidence, only fleeting glimpses.
Sorry for the interruption. Attention all juniors and seniors. Generation Tech will be in the lecture hall right now during AE for all you guys for the presentation. Again, Generation Tech will be in the lecture hall during AE for your presentation, all juniors and seniors. Have a good day, Wolves.
Some days he believed in it, some days not. There was no evidence, only fleeting glimpses that might mean anything or nothing. Snatches of overheard conversations, faint scribbles on lavatory walls. Once, even, when two strangers met, a small movement of the hand that looked as though it might be a signal of recognition. It was all guesswork. Very likely he imagined everything. He had gone back to his cubicle without looking at O'Brien again. The idea of following up on their momentary contact never hardly crossed his mind. It would have been inconceivably dangerous even if he had known about how to set about doing it. For a second, 2 seconds, they exchanged an equivocal glance, and that was the end of the story. But even that was a memorable event, in locked loneliness in which one had to live. Winston roused himself and sat up straighter. He let out a belch. The gin was rising in his stomach. His eyes refocused on the page. He discovered that while he sat helplessly musing, he had also been writing, as though by automatic action. And it was no longer the same cramped, awkward handwriting as before. His pen slid down voluptuously over the smooth paper, writing in large, neat capitals, down with Big Brother, 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 over and over again, filling half the page. He could not help feeling a twinge of panic. It was absurd, since writing of those particular words was not dangerous than the initial act of opening the diary, but for a moment he was tempted to tear out the spoiled pages and abandon the enterprise altogether. He did not do so, however, because he knew that it was useless, whether he wrote down with Big Brother or whether he refrained from writing it made no difference. Whether he went on with the diary or whether he did not go on with it made no difference. The thought police would get him just the same. He had committed, and would still have committed, even if he had never set pen to paper, the essential crime that contained all others in itself. Thought crime, they called it. Thought crime was not a thing that could be concealed forever. You might dodge successfully for a while, even for years, but sooner or later they were bound to get you. So, this is evidence again for my claim that they want a dumb population. It was always at night. The arrests invariably happened at night. The sudden jerk out of sleep, the rough hand shaking your shoulder, the lights glaring in your eyes, the ring of hard faces round the bed. In the vast majority of cases, there was no trial, no report of the arrest. People simply disappeared, always during the night. Your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you have ever done was wiped out. Your one-time existence was denied and then forgotten. You were abolished, annihilated, vaporized was the usual word. For a moment, he was seized into a kind of hysteria. He began writing in a hurried, untidy scrawl. They'll shoot me, I don't care. They'll shoot me in the back of the neck, I don't care. Down with Big Brother. They always shoot you in the back of the neck, I don't care. Down with Big Brother. He sat back in his chair, slightly ashamed of himself, and laid down the pen. The next moment, he started violently. There was a knocking on the door. Already, he sat still as a mouse, in a futile hope that whoever it was might go away after a single attempt. But no, the knocking repeated. The worst of all would be to delay. His heart was thumping like a drum, but his face, from long habit, was probably expressionless. He got up and moved heavily towards the door. All right, I think we're going to stop for today, but a rundown or a summary of Chapter 1. Winston is our main character. He lives in Oceania. We can conclude that he does not agree with the party. Oop, what happened? Let's go. Come on. Oh no, okay. So, Winston, main character. Now, I do have a question about Winston, and I'm going to put this right here. Named after Winston Churchill. I think Churchill only has one. There we go. Similar to like how in Lost, John Locke is named after, the philosopher John Locke. Lives in Oceania. He does not agree with the party. The party has the 2-minute hate. They have thought police plus patrol. And what else can we say? Goldstein is the enemy. Oops, I don't want to. Equals enemy. And Big Brother equals hero. I'm going to stop for right now. I will probably work on chapter 2 when school is let out. But let's see how many pages is in that. Ooh. All right. So yeah, I'll definitely read chapter